Okay, so here's one. Are there any contexts where Bayesianism has utility?
Yes, there certainly are, but I recognize that I went first on the last question, so I'll give you the option to go first on this one if you would like it.
100%, yeah. So the word Bayesianism can mean so many different things to so many different people, which is why it can be quite confusing. So let's just distinguish between statistical Bayesianism and Bayesian epistemology, where Bayesian epistemology is all the stuff that we don't like or that I don't like, the credence stuff, the belief stuff, the EA stuff. Bad. Don't like that. The good stuff, the good stuff is just, so basically everyone knows about stable diffusion now. Stable diffusion inside uses something called the variational autoencoder, and you could not have created a variational autoencoder without Bayesian statistics, because you just need this kind of math to create that kind of thing. Bayesianism is used all throughout stats. So Andrew Gelman is a good Bayesian statistician. It's used across 1,000 different engineering disciplines. And that's just a totally different thing than what Bayesian epistemology is all about. But people often do a Mott and Bailey kind of thing, where they'll argue for the credences, and they say that's ridiculous, and then they'll point you towards Andrew Gelman as evidence that Bayesianism is good. And they're just conflating these different ways that Bayes' theorem, because don't forget, Bayesianism is based on a mathematical theorem. And you can just take that theorem and use it in a bunch of places. And it's like using the Pythagorean theorem or something. It's very useful in a lot of spots. And so, of course, you're going to use it. And if you're using it in those ways, then it's great. And all sorts of tech has been built out of it. So that'd be my answer.
Nice. Yeah. I kind of feel the obligation to just clarify a couple of things about Bayesian statistics because I think people are confused, especially in like CR space about statistics. Yeah. So Bayesian statistics, so forgetting the epistemology for a second, Bayesian statistics is all about just viewing the parameter of whatever you're interested in. So if we're talking about statistical inference in general, the basic idea is to try and learn some unknown parameter. So think of like if someone gives you a coin and it's biased in some way. So it has like, it's weighted in some way such that it's 70% chance to land heads, 30% to land tails or something. So someone just gives you this coin, you don't know that it's 70. So there's some parameter, right, that you're trying to learn the bias of the coin. Just it's like 0.7 in this case, right? And the difference between Bayesian and frequentist statistics is how they view that parameter.
Exactly.
So frequentist statistics views that parameter as fixed but unknown, right? So there's a true parameter out there, in this case like 0.7, but it's unknown. And so now you do a bunch of stuff. You flip the coin a bunch of times, right? And you try and learn the parameter using various statistical methods. You come up with confidence intervals for their parameter, et cetera, et cetera. Bayesianism, in terms of statistics, what it does is it says, actually, I'm going to treat that parameter as random. So now it's not fixed but unknown. It's random and unknown.
Well, and so just to add, for me, that always tripped me up when I was first learning about this. By random, you mean it is now a distribution. So instead of it being a 0.7, which would be a fixed point single number, you'd say it's a Gaussian where the mean is 0.7, but it has a spread of 4 or something. So instead of looking at a single number, when you say treating it as random, you mean that is actually a distribution. So it visualize a bell curve in your head. So the bell curve, as you learn more and more about that parameter, the bell curve gets tighter and tighter and tighter until the Gaussian just becomes a straight line. And when it becomes a straight line, then you would say that is a deterministic parameter, or it's non-random. So it's a harder problem because you're having to learn a whole Gaussian distribution in this case, rather than just a single value.
Exactly. So where priors and stuff come in Bayesian statistics is with that random parameter. So what you'll do is put literally a prior distribution over the parameter. You choose what sort of distribution it is, right? So like you were talking about, maybe you start with a Gaussian. So you assume that the parameter is distributed as some Gaussian. Then you do a bunch of experiments, and then you can update your understanding of like what the distribution over this parameter looked like. That's called the posterior. And you develop a bunch of statistical methods to do this. So, okay, frequentist Bayesian statistics is like how you view the parameter. Is it random or not? And Bayesian statistics, like if you talk to any modern statistician, they'll tell you that Bayesian statistics has its uses in a wide variety of fields, right? Mm-hmm. So just the math that has been developed for Bayesian inference is like very useful in a wide variety of settings. And so there are very few statisticians nowadays who would call themselves either frequentists or statisticians, Bayesians or frequentists. That's like a very outdated debate. Like most statisticians just view statistical inference as some sort of tool, right? And you pick what you're going to apply to a specific problem based on the properties of the problem, right? And then different methods just have different guarantees they give you. And then you work with those guarantees and et cetera, et cetera. So you choose what you're going to do based on the problem. And very few statisticians would say like, I'm a Bayesian or I'm a frequentist now.
Can I add one thing to that? So I think all computer science students, ML students, stats students will have this moment where they learn about Bayesianism and frequentism, and then they learn that it's like a big debate and the teacher's not going to go into it. And they're like, what the fuck is the debate about? Like, this just seems like a totally valid thing to do, and it has its uses in some places. So what's the debate about? And what the debate is about is the philosophy underlying what you just said. So if you have a coin, the coin will be weighted, let's say 70. So you imagine there's a hidden parameter inside the coin, and that parameter determines if the coin flips heads with 70% probability or tails with 30% probability. And the frequentist would say, that parameter is just a value. It doesn't make any sense to treat that as a random variable. There's not a distribution inside the coin. What the fuck are you talking about? So the frequentist would say, this doesn't even make sense to treat it as a random variable. What do you mean by random? And then the Bayesian in like the 1940s, when this debate was actually happening, would say, well, what I mean by that is there's a belief about the parameter. And so the probability makes sense because I'm talking about my belief on the parameter, and that's where the belief stuff comes in.
Exactly.
So downstream of all the philosophy debates, it's just different mathematical tools that are very useful in different circumstances. The reason why there's a debate, or the reason why there used to be a debate, is because of this interpretation of probability. But from a math and stats perspective, the interpretation doesn't matter. What matters is if it works or not. But the EA folks have gone to the right, and the philosophy folks have gone to the right, and the stats folks have gone to the left. And so the stuff that we're arguing about is what happens when you take this idea of belief and probability too seriously and apply it in places outside of statistics. And that's how the belief and frequency stuff all ties together. But that's also why if you talk to modern statisticians and you ask them about Bayesianism, they'll just describe what you've said. You ask them, why is it controversial, or why do you use the word belief? And they'll be like, I don't really know. It's just how we talk about it. Like they won't actually. They won't,
the language has just come along for the ride, but like
exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, so that was great. And then the final clarification is just Bayes' theorem is not only used in Bayesian statistics.
Exactly.
So Bayes' theorem is, there's many frequentist situations in which you would use Bayes' theorem. And in fact, I Googled Bayes' theorem very quickly before this, and the examples on Wikipedia are frequentist examples. So you just have like like data of like how many people were tested for a certain treatment, and of how many people that got tested actually had cancer, et cetera. And then the question is like, if you get diagnosed with cancer, how likely are you to actually have cancer, et cetera? And for that, you use Bayes' theorem. But you don't actually have to use Bayesian statistics. You don't have to put a parameter distribution over the probability over the parameter. And so when people are talking about Bayes' theorem in statistics, that doesn't mean that they're like using Bayesian techniques. So this is why the language can get very confusing. This will also lead people to say certain things that are wrong. Stuff like, well, Nate Silver is a Bayesian, because he talks about Bayes' theorem lots in his book, Signal and Noise, where it's like, I'm not sure what he would actually call himself. Maybe he would call himself a Bayesian, but most of the examples he describes in that book when he uses Bayes' theorem are actually just like frequentist examples. So he just has he just has count data, and he's like doing some updating based on that data.
So I've described Nate Silver as a Bayesian statistician. And what I mean by that specifically is that in his book, Signal and the Noise, I think at the end of every chapter, he literally puts a value on his belief, and he provides a posterior about how his belief has been updated. And that gives the reader no information whatsoever, but he thinks it gives them a lot of information about how his belief has been changed based on the evidence. So all that part of his book, I just think is stupid. It's not really getting you anything. But because he included that, that's why I think in one of my blog posts, called him a Bayesian statistician. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, that's good to know. But yeah, many of the actual examples in that book you actually don't need, and especially like sports analytics in general, I think like doesn't use much Bayesian stuff because you have all this data. You have all
exactly.
This,
like, yeah. So for one other thing, I'll add. I found earlier in my conversations with Mauricio on the podcast and in the blog exchange that we had, which is available on my website if anyone wants to see what I'm talking about. I found to just try to cut through is it Bayesian or frequentist statistics, because the conversation was getting bogged down on that or not. I just said, is your method using data or is it not using data? Because that line was a much clearer distinction between the stuff I don't like and the stuff I do like. So as long as you're using a lot of data and analyzing it with mathematical tools, obviously modulo if the data analysis is correct or not, but let's assuming it's correct, then I'm fine with that. But if you're just coming up with random beliefs and then because you're quote a Bayesian and beliefs equal probability, now you can use probability, now you can use math, and now you can come up with the probability of superintelligence in 1,000 years or whatever. And all of that is not using any data. Show me the Excel sheet, show me the CSV, show me the JSON. What are you counting? What are you measuring? And if you can't point to that, then you're probably doing the Bayesian epistemology stuff, which is what we've been objecting to. But just as a shorthand tool for anyone who's trying to cut their way through this conversation, using are they processing data or not? The filter heuristic is I think one nice way to start separating the two, the good kind of Bayesianism with the bad kind of Bayesianism.
Nice, yeah. All right, so hopefully that cleared up any confusion we have left in our wake in the past. And I'm sure in the future we will err and just say Bayesianism when we either mean Bayesian statistics or Bayesian epistemology, and you'll have to infer it from context. But we'll try and be more specific. But anyway, I get the sense that that's creating like a lot of confusion, especially on Twitter when I see people start debating statistics, and it's like, oh boy.
Yeah. It's a huge Mott and Bailey, right? Yeah. So you make an absurd statement, then you just back up to the Andrew Gelmans of the world, and then but it just shows that people are. But like even like stats and ML folks who have PhDs and are professors haven't gone to the philosophy component, and so they're just busy doing their math and publishing cool stuff, but they're not too into the philosophy side of things, and so even they probably will get confused on these subjects just because they don't have any need to go into the philosophy side of things.
In fact, if they rediscover it and then give hour-long lectures at conferences about it, then they get applauded off the stage, even though they're just repeating the last 100 years of... Who's
this? I don't actually catch this reference.
There's this professor at Harvard CS called Cynthia Dwork, who's like huge in... she's done a couple things. I think most recently she's gotten into fairness. So I don't really know any of her work, but she's like quite a big name. And anyway, my supervisor sent around this her lecture recently, just joking that like she had just rediscovered the last like 150 years of work on the philosophy of probability, because she just started making all these distinctions that like, if you're familiar with the stuff, you're like, I mean, yes. But like it's I mean, it's confusing enough, and it's not really taught, in part probably because it doesn't have to be. Like most people just view it as like this instrumental thing that they use to solve problems, and that's great. That's what it is. And so, but anyway, it's just funny that like you could rediscover it and get, oh my God.
Does Addy, so for the audience, Addy is Ben's advisor. Does he know all about the philosophy of probability and stuff? Like, is he into that subject and things?
In probably slightly different ways than we are. Like, I'm not sure what his views would be on it, but he's pretty interested in like the foundations of probability and whatnot. And especially, I think, because he's been developing this line of like game theoretic probability, which we won't go into for the audience, which is...
But actually, so that's interesting, because if you back that up, so you get to Glenn Schaefer, and Glenn Schaefer, if you back that up, he's tried to come up with different ways to represent beliefs using math. Yeah. So he came up with different two-dimensional ways to represent beliefs rather than just a single dimension. There's an interesting connection between that.
Yeah. I mean, the old school statisticians were definitely like more interested in that stuff, because they, like you said earlier, like the debates and like the raging debates in like the 30s and 40s, like basically viewed Bayesian statistics and epistemology as the same thing. Yeah. So I'm not sure. We haven't like sat down and had a long conversation about it. I'd be pretty intrigued about his view, but he's definitely aware of like the debates and what people think. I mean, CMU itself was like a huge hotspot of Bayesianism back in the day. Like some of the big early Bayesians were there. So and now it's funny because the department's like almost move in the other direction. Recently, I would say like most people do mostly like frequentist type work, but it was like a big thing for Bayesianism back in the day. So a lot of like the older professors still are like aware of that older generation, and so there's still like some of those.
Just you won't say this about yourself, but I'll say it. CMU is like one of the top schools for stats in the world. Some of the biggest statisticians are there. And Ben is working for one of them, who comes from Michael Jordan's lab. And so Ben is working at one of the top stats labs in the world, but he's too humble to say that. So just to give some cred to my boy Ben.